Welcome. I'm Meredith Howard, the coordinator of the Alden Family Center. This podcast is a way to foster new connections within our community and an opportunity for the Family Center to host discussions with community members who offer unique and valuable opportunities. Today, I invite you to join us for a podcast, Building Connections, that is focused on the topic of grief and loss. We're fortunate enough to have Andrea Row from Resilience Lab and Arrow Integrative Coaching here today as she shares her expertise surrounding grief and loss. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Meredith.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Andrea, you are a therapist who is certified in grief counseling and specializes in spouse, partner loss, trauma, widowed, parenting, and neurodiversity. We so much appreciate you coming in today. If you want to kind of give your brief introduction, who you are and kind of what you like to do and how this journey happened for you.
Sure. So like you said, I'm a therapist and integrative coach and certified grief counselor. My introduction to the field actually was before, obviously, I became all of these titles. I had lost my husband back in 2008 when our children were very, very young. And having that experience and going through, I had also become involved with working with an organization that helped widowed people. It was a nonprofit, and that gave me a lot of really wonderful experience helping other people in similar situations as myself and my children. And years of doing that really led me to the direction of therapy and grief counseling, and because it's so fulfilling and makes my loss have a purpose.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it's extra meaningful to you having gone through it yourself and then, being able to help others through it.
Yes.
I think that's really courageous.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask about some of the most common questions you get about grief and loss as a counselor. What do you tend to get, and what do you think? Just what kind of questions do you get?
I think the biggest one is, how do I get past this? How do I feel better? And another is, how do I help someone I love going through grief? Mm-hmm. I think that our society is kind of ill-prepared for people who are grieving. We're a very individualistic society, and that hurts us in ways, and it ends up isolating people who are grieving more than they would be otherwise. People tend to avoid uncomfortable things. So when grieving, a lot of times our instinct is to shove it down, try to put on a face that they're okay so that they won't repel people. Mm-hmm. And then, other people who are faced with someone who is in deep grief, they aren't sure quite what to say or what to do. And so, a lot of platitudes come out that might not be really comforting. And so those are the biggest questions that I typically get.
Yeah. And I can see that too, because I think a lot of people, have their own view of grief and what they bring to the, what their perception of is it. Mm-hmm. So when, you're trying to support someone else who has recently gone through a loss of some kind, it can be difficult to know how to help or support that person.
Yes, and it's difficult to put yourself in someone's shoes if you haven't experienced something like that yourself, so it's hard to imagine just how much of their life is affected and how deeply it impacts them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. What range of emotions do you see when you're going through grief, or what range of emotions do you feel?
It really includes all of them. And it can get confusing because there could be conflicting emotions. Like sometimes, in just about every case, there's sadness, and there can be anger, there can be relief, there can be just a very wide range of mixed emotions that bring all of your emotions to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that also, kind of goes it's very individual based on what the loss is and how it was experienced. Was it, a chronic loss, or was it a sudden loss? I think all those play a role, but like you said, that range of emotions can be great.
Yeah, and I think that no matter how long, how much you think you're prepared for someone's, for losing someone important to you, I don't think that, when it happens, you're just never really quite prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And, so it's, there's this big debate about what's worse, a sudden loss or, a long-term illness that led to a loss. And there's really no answer to that. It's they all suck.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I often think about that too. And I've heard that discussion and, that debate, and it's, you can't really win. There's no right or wrong in that one. No. Now I wanted to kind of move on to talk about the types of supports that you need when someone or yourself is going through a loss. So I always get this question: what do you say to someone who has just gone through some sort of loss? Like, what's the best way to say or to support them? And then also, like, what are some things that maybe you should stay away from saying?
Things to say would be, I'm here for you. I'm willing to listen. You're not alone. I'm so sorry. There's a lot of things that are, just kind of the typical things. However, you do want to avoid platitudes because don't say they're in a better place. Don't say you're young and you'll meet someone new. Don't say things like that because they don't make you feel better. What the person needs is just someone to be present for them and with them, and to stay present for them because, a lot of times support falls away, 6 months to a year after someone's loss, and grief doesn't end after 1 year. It continues, and it just changes shape and size and, different dimensions. But frequently people who have lost someone very important to them will experience a lot of secondary losses that add to the grief. And, we don't want the people that we love to be another secondary loss because they are uncomfortable with how being around us because we're sad. Yeah. Anger is another emotion that I want to mention about, that grief can bring out. And it's very, very common. And I think, people don't understand that sometimes either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, you could bring up a good point about the secondary loss because, I think from my experience seeing, when somebody has had experienced a grief or loss situation, you have a lot in the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to be there to comfort you. You have those supports and people want to be there and understanding. And then it seems to kind of trickle away after a while. And, it experiences, like you talked about earlier, that isolation situation and, not being very aware of not losing those secondary connections that you have.
Yeah, and it can get really tricky when you've lost a spouse or partner. Like you're typically in your social circles have pretty much revolved around a duo. You go out with other couples, your partnership, and you have all these connections with other people through each other. And when you don't have that other person, you kind of lose your place in society to some degree as a spouse or partner, in your social circle as, a couple, and that can really change the dynamics of just about almost every relationship in your life as well.
Yeah. And especially probably since if you have, children as well, I think that adds another layer.
Absolutely.
To it. I wanted to kind of move on to talking about, now that we've talked a little bit about like supports and, what grief is and what, how some of the emotions that go along with it. Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of those, like things we can do to support? Like what are those factors, those coping skills that we can do as someone who is supporting someone going through a loss, and also if you're experiencing a loss yourself? What's helpful?
When you are supporting someone, like I mentioned before, being there, maybe see if you can identify needs that they have that maybe they're not able to identify, because a lot of people will say, let me know if you need anything, and a lot of times that person doesn't even know what they need because they're just so,
Sure.
in shock or numb or just, overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can identify a need, like, if you see their grass is growing really long, go over there with a mower and just mow it,
Yeah.
And, if they need some more toilet paper products, just, drop them on their front porch and ring the doorbell, or, just show up with things, say, hey, is there a night that you want me to take the kids and, give you a break, or, hey, would you like to go out, to get out of the house and get some fresh air and just have coffee or something, I can bring some over if you don't want to leave, and just showing up. As far as what to do if you are that person who is deeply grieving, have patience with yourself. Don't try to make sense of anything, because it's not going to make sense. Have patience with other people too, because they're gonna, most of the time people have good intentions and they want to help, but they'll say dumb things, and do what you can to keep peace in your life. If there are people in your life that are adding angst or, more layers than you need, it's okay to create some distance. Keep those people close to you who feel good to be around, do what you can just to get through from day to day, just survive any way you can in those first, days, weeks, months, whatever you need to do to survive. And then when you kind of can, have your head together just a little bit more, maybe incorporate some things that you can do to create, like calm your nervous system. Things that, incorporate things that you find, things that you enjoy. They might look different than they did before. And that's okay. Creating peace in your life, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And I think that goes to also say, self-care is very important.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think, just in general, our lives get so busy and chaotic, and, we get set in our routines and our responsibilities that it's tough to take that time and do that self-care that we need.
Some basics like, eat 3 meals a day, as much as you can. You might have no appetite, you might be eating your pain away, just try to incorporate whole foods in that, have, like things that are healthy and will nourish your body. Drink a lot of water, because, crying is very dehydrating. Try to get sleep. I know that can be extremely difficult too. If you can take a nap, take a nap to kind of make up for what you might not be getting at night. Get in the shower and let the water kind of give you a fresh start, Sort of like, just real basic things are probably some of the most important things, because I think that we neglect ourselves and forget everything when we're going through that.
No, those are very good points to remember. I think it's always, it's the simple things sometimes that you forget. Or
take your medicine
lost.
And your vitamins.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about just grief looks different in adults versus children, right?
Yes.
So if you could talk a little bit about what does grief look like for children?
For children at different stages, it can look very different. So kids grieve differently than adults. Very, very young children, like up to maybe age 3 or 4, they'll seem oblivious. They will be affected by it. like if it's a parent or a close person in their lives that was a regular person, a part of their life, that will show up in different ways. They won't show it necessarily like an adult will. They won't say, I miss, my dad or my mom. I miss, they're just they could cry. They could just go on playing like nothing happened. They might say things like, let's get a new daddy, and it doesn't mean that they don't love their dad any less, but they just, they're kids. They come out with really interesting things, But kids that are a little older, they're very literal. I mean, all children are very literal up to a certain age. I think it's like around maybe grade 4 that they start.
Okay.
Maybe grade 4 or 5. They're not quite as literal. Mm-hmm. So like if you say, something about, the body, if they overhear things, they're going to maybe come up with a story in their head or this visualization of like a headless person, So like make sure that you ask them what is their understanding of what's going on, find out what they know first and what they think. And then if you need to make corrections, you can make corrections that way in an age appropriate way. Just so that they know what's going on. They know what to expect. It's hard for anyone really to know what to expect, but like if you're going to a funeral, for instance, you want to give them some more information that they will understand so that they kind of know what they're going into. Adolescents and teens, they will, there's an expression, the kids that need the most love will ask for it in the most unloving ways. Mm-hmm. And so they're likely to act out, rebel. Mm-hmm. They might isolate. And so that they're not going to maybe express themselves and what they're thinking and feeling. They're going to, probably hold it in and try to not let anybody know what's going on. It's also, grief and loss for a kid in school is, like most kids in school want to fit in with their peers, and they don't want to stand out in a way that's going to draw attention to them, especially negative attention. Mm-hmm. So they typically will not disclose what they're going through or their loss, because kids can be mean. They can say really mean things. And so, most likely they're not going to want to talk about it. So they're the ones that are going to really need to have someone show up for them and give them a safe space to be able to express themselves, or just to be, whoever they are and whatever they're going through.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think, for, especially adolescents. It's really hard to connect with them sometimes in ways that, you would typically connect with a younger child and, or an adult. So you really have to figure out what's best. But I think those are some great tips on how to do that.
Yeah, and the kids at any age are going to say things that could be shocking. They could be uncomfortable for adults to hear. The adult might not know how to respond. Try not to be shocked, and put off by some of the things that they come out with. Just, hold space for them and with a non-judgmental, loving presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and staying calm too. I know as a parent, your emotions are so involved when you're talking with your kids, and being able to stay calm when they tell you things that might be a little shocking, or you might not necessarily know that was happening too, is tough. I always picture that, like being the duck in the water where, you're very calm on top, but then underneath you're paddling like crazy to say, that's a lot of times I picture that as, it's your role as a parent with adolescents.
I think that's everyone, to some extent, we're putting on a good face for everybody, but inside we're we could be having a whole different experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. That is a lot of people, right? All right. I just wanted to mention a couple other things, get your thoughts on a couple other things. Mm-hmm. How do you think cultural differences affect the grieving process? Or have you noticed in your experience, cultural differences?
You know, a lot of cultures have different approaches to grief, you know, where like many cultures who are more collectivist, you know, like where they have community, that they embrace each other, you know, that's that, you know, people are more able and willing to show their grief and be, you know, more open about it and grieve out loud, you know. Because they'll be embraced by their community and they come together and help each other and support each other. In a more individualistic society, like in the U.S., you know, we're less likely, or, you know, like there's other cultures in our U.S., obviously, but, you know, the American type of culture is more individualistic. And, you know, we're not really as equipped, I think, to support each other the way that, you know, a lot of other cultures can and do. And I think it's great to borrow some of those practices for each other, you know, and what you know, kind of discover what works for you, you know. And, you know, I think it's important to keep an open mind because other cultures may have different beliefs, and that is perfectly fine. If that's something that, you know, that's something that they put into practice that maybe somebody else doesn't, it doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it different, you know, and different can be good.
Yeah. And you want to support other people's cultures and you want to support like whatever is going to comfort them.
Yes.
Right? So, you know, having an understanding of someone else's culture when it comes to losing someone or the grief process is, you know, I think very important.
It is, and not trying to impose your beliefs or your practices on somebody else.
Yes.
You know, that's a big thing. And, you know, some people's beliefs might shift, you know, with their loss. And so just being aware that, you know, just follow their lead and, you know, just be open and have an open mind.
Yeah, I like that. Follow their lead. But yeah, I think that's great advice. And, you know, I think it's helpful to just kind of talk about it and, you know, talk things through and, you know, just having this conversation, you know, I think is helpful. And, you know, maybe people will change or be more open or, you know, look at grief and loss differently too.
I think it's good to talk about it. You know, it's not talked about enough. You know, if it was more incorporated in our conversations and our regular daily lives, you know, we might be more comfortable. You know, I think we would be better equipped to, I mean, grief is something that we all go through. You know, everybody dies, you know, it's part of life.
Yeah.
And we're, you know, I think a lot of people in our society also is just so afraid of death, and we do everything to prevent it. So, you know, when it happens, we're kind of at a loss, you know?
Yeah.
So I think talking about it is really, really healthy. Having it become a regular part of conversation and not so taboo, you know, I think that can be very helpful also.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. That's great points. So I wanted to give this opportunity for you to share anything else that you would like to share. You know, I appreciate you sitting down and having this conversation with us.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much. This is an amazing opportunity.
Oh, no. Yeah. I'm glad it happened. And, you know, hopefully, you know, if it just, you know, changes one person's view or helps one person or supports one person, I think it's definitely worth it. Yeah, no, I think that's, you know, the benefits are endless to something like that. And, you know, being able to talk about those topics that sometimes people don't know how to bring up or aren't comfortable bringing up, you know.
Yeah, and it's great because I get to witness like they feel like the look on their face, their load is lightened a little from getting an opportunity to talk about some of these things, you know, and have some questions answered or just be able to commiserate, with others who get it,
Yeah,
'cause
yeah.
a lot of people just don't get it. And that's, and that can be hard.
Yeah. And sometimes you just need to do that. You need to let it all out. And we talked about the anger and just,
Yeah.
just being able to like commiserate together, is very
Exactly.
therapeutic. So in its
Yeah.
own way. I think we all know that. But yeah, thank you so much. And
You're so welcome.
appreciate you and all the work you do and, all the people you support. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep.